Chapter 19. The Myth of Creation. Mythology, noun, the body of a primitive people's beliefs concerning its origin, early history, heroes, deities, and so forth, as distinguished from the true accounts which it invents later. Ambrose Bierce. Once upon a time, before the birth of time, there existed a great beholder. Not only was he a great beholder, but he was the only beholder. The great beholder could see everything forever in all directions, which would have made him very happy had there been anything to see. But in all directions there was nothing forever. The great beholder was pure awareness, but there was nothing to be aware of. This made the great beholder very sad. The great beholder had two qualities that seemed like they were very good qualities, but they were actually very bad qualities. They were very bad because they made the great beholder very sad. The first of these two qualities was infinite infinitude. Because the great beholder was everything, there was nothing other than him, so he could never have a friend to play with or a dark place to explore. The second of these two qualities was perfect perfection. Because the great beholder was incapable of error, there could never be anything different or unexpected, so he could never experience surprise and delight. Then one day, the great beholder had an idea. This would have been the very first idea ever, if there really was such a thing as time. But time is just an idea, so everything really happens at once, which is not a problem because nothing really happens at all. Can you imagine if you had to do everything at once? Thank you, time. I am the great beholder, he thought, but there is nothing to behold. I am pure awareness, but there's nothing to be aware of. There's only me, so there's nothing to see, but maybe I could imagine something else. And thus was born the illusion of appearance. So he did. The great beholder said, "Let there be something else." And there was something else. And he looked upon it and saw that it was good. Now there was both a beholder and a beheld, and although the beheld was only in the great beholder's imagination, it was way better than nothing. Of course, there could never really be something else, because the great beholder was infinitely infinite. But now there was the dream of something else, and the great beholder had the appearance of otherness to be aware of. And thus was born the illusion of two. Then, one day, the great beholder had another idea. For what else was there for him to do but sit around and have ideas all day? I think I'll imagine a whole bunch of something else, he thought, and then I won't be bored any more. So the great beholder imagined an infinite universe, and he filled it with all manner of something else, like planets and stars and rivers and trees and animals, and he called it his imaginary playground. And thus was born the illusion of time-space, energy-matter, duality, causality, and life. But the great beholder was still sad, because he was still bored, because his imaginary playground was perfectly perfect. So there was never any imperfection. Everything always made perfect sense, which was perfectly dull. The great beholder watched galaxies and planets spinning around, but that only made him dizzy. Then he watched animals running around and eating and making more animals, but that only made him sleepy. Everything in the imaginary playground worked exactly as it was supposed to all of the time. So how could the great beholder ever feel surprise and delight? He couldn't. So he was still bored. So he was still sad. Then one day, the great beholder had another idea. Maybe I can imagine the imaginary playground so it isn't perfect, he thought. If everything didn't always make perfect sense, then it would be able to surprise and delight me. But sadly, because he was perfectly perfect, the great beholder could not imagine imperfection, so he was still sad. Then, one day, the great beholder had another idea. Maybe, he thought, I might enjoy my imaginary playground if I could play in it instead of just looking at it. But gosh, he wondered, how? I can't imagine anything more than perfect, and I can't imagine anything less than perfect, he reasoned. But maybe I can imagine someone who can. So the great beholder imagined a finite version of himself, a little beholder, and placed it in his imaginary playground. And thus was born the illusion of self. But alas, the little beholder knew he was really the great beholder, so he knew everything about everything, and he was still bored, so he was still sad. What's the point of having an imaginary playground and a little beholder if I still can't be surprised and delighted? The great beholder asked himself. No point, he answered. No point whatsoever, he added for emphasis. Then, one day, the great beholder had another idea. Maybe, he thought, I could pluck out the memory of the little beholder, who is really just me, and then I could explore the imaginary playground without knowing who I really am. I could tie a blindfold around the little beholder's brain, and then I could experience surprise and delight. And lo, it worked! The little beholder walked around and played and explored, and everything was a source of surprise and delight, and a lion ate him. And thus was born the illusion of ignorance. So now, the great beholder imagined many little beholders, and sprinkled them throughout his imaginary playground, and he plucked out their memories and blindfolded their brains so they couldn't remember who they really were or know what was really going on. Where that memory had been, there was now a scary hole, which made the little beholders tremble with terrible dread and look away. And thus was born the illusion of emotion. So now, the great beholder had solved the two problems that caused him to feel boredom and sadness. One problem that caused the great beholder's boredom and sadness was his perfect perfection. For the great beholder, everything must always make perfect sense. 1 plus 1 must always equal 2. 1 plus 1 could never equal 3, or 33, or a slice of pie. But for the little beholders, it was different. The great beholder was perfectly perfect and couldn't make the imaginary playground imperfect. But he could make the little beholders behold it imperfectly. Imperfection could not lie in the beheld, but it could lie in the eye of the beholder. 1 plus 1 must always equal 2, but the great beholder could jigger and boggle the little beholders so they would believe it equaled 3, or 33, or a slice of pie. Of course, the little beholders were really pure awareness, like the great beholder, but because they were imaginary creatures, they could have their awareness distorted, contorted, befuddled, bamboozled, twisty-turned, and just plain higgledy-piggledy gobbledygooked. And thus was born the illusion of nonsense. The other problem that caused the great beholder's sadness and boredom was that he was infinitely infinite. He saw everything, and knew everything, and was everything, so he could never be surprised and delighted. But for the little beholders, it was different. The great beholder could not be finite, but the little beholders could. They could have a beginning, and a middle, and an end. They could be here, but not there, now, but not then, this, but not that. The little beholders were really infinite, like the great beholder, because they really were the great beholder, but because they were imagined, they could be imagined in tiny, polarized units that could attract and repel each other. And thus was born the illusion of harmony and conflict. So, now, there were many little beholders at play in the imaginary playground of the great beholder, all having their own adventures. And even though none of them knew it, they were all really the great beholder incognito, so all of their adventures were really his adventures. "And now I have many friends," the great beholder exclaimed, "and I'll never be lonely again." And thus was born the illusion of connection. It was like having a super-duper television with billions of channels that he could watch all at once. And he could be the star of every show and experience all the drama and conflict and comedy and tragedy. He could be silly and nonsensical and wise and foolish and crazy and clever and all the wonderful things that he could never be on his own. "Oh, joy!" cried the great beholder. "Now I will never be bored again. Now I can laugh and sing and dance and play. I can commit acts of heroism and cowardice, kindness and brutality. I can create and procreate and co-create and miscreate. I can believe in clever lies and silly truths. I can be wrong and ignorant and scared and mean. I can be villain and hero, madman and saint, criminal and victim, peasant and king. I can create magnificent cities and smash them to bits. I can experience pleasure and pain and all the emotions, agony no less than elation, suffering no less than joy, hatred no less than love. But let's go easy on peace and contentment, because that's pretty boring. And seriously, what's the point, right? And this is how the great beholder overcame the curious problems of perfect perfection and infinite infinitude. And now, the great beholder is so happy that he wants to clap his hands together. But the only hands he has to clap with are yours. So now, great beholder, clap your hands together in surprise and delight.